This programme was produced at and first aired on MPR, Manawatu People's Radio, with support from New Zealand On Air. Ka pai e Rangi Tamotu, MPR.
Kia ora and welcome to Reserved Recommendations. This is a show about great trash, difficult art, and our complicated relationships with art and culture. My name's Hugh, I'm the host of the show, and I'd like to take this opportunity to put in a very mild content warning for the show as a whole. Sometimes our recommendations on this show are reserved just because the thing that we're discussing is in some way not good, but sometimes there are aspects of the art or artist that may be confronting for some people. Check the episode descriptions for more information, and do be aware of your listening environment. This evening I am talking to Tim Denee of Old Dog Games, and we're talking about Deadlands, which is very exciting because Tim actually used to run a game of Deadlands when we were both in high school that I used to play in, and oh boy, does Deadlands have some stuff in it that's fascinating to talk about. So I guess, like, first off though, before we get to Deadlands, this is part of like the series of conversations that I'm having with New Zealand role-playing peoples because Kiwi RPG Week is coming up. Like, tell us real quick a little bit about Old Dog Games.
Well, thanks for having me. Old Dog Games is just sort of a name I publish little things under, role-playing, Kiwi RPG role-playing stuff. So some of it is actual plays, so like documentation of games I've played and comics and journals and stuff. So that stuff's pretty fun. And then some of it moves up to like resources, like maps and things for different games, like Blades in the Dark. And then there are a few games I've done as well. So I published a game called Odyssey Aquatica, which is kind of a life aquatics, Jacques Cousteau sort of thing. It was quite fun. And going to publish later this year a game called Deathmatch Island, which is sort of Squid Game meets Lost, kind of weird island with weird games sort of stuff going on.
And thinking about like the illustrated supplements, if your name seems like vaguely familiar in the back of people's heads, that's because you did, in particular, a series of short comics about the game Dwarf Fortress that went like mildly viral for a while.
Yeah, that's right. Back in 2010, I published a Dwarf Fortress comic, and became strangely viral.
It's weird how that stuff happens because you can never ever pick what thing is going to do it, or it's deeply odd.
People sort of come back to you after years and mention it, and you've sort of forgotten all about this thing you put out there.
Absolutely. Like I wrote an angry screed pretending to be a role-playing game with a friend of mine, and we put it on the internet for free, and every couple of years someone gets in touch and says, "Are you that Hugh? This thing was..."
It's amazing.
Yeah, I'm glad that people are connecting with it. It, in my view, is probably morally indefensible. But, these things happen. Speaking of things which are in some way morally indefensible, Deadlands. Deadlands is like the shortest way to explain it to people would be to lean on the Will Smith movie Wild West,
yeah,
because they're both drawing on the same tradition of like the Weird West, so like the Wild West but with magic and steampunk and stuff.
Yeah,
like. How did you come across it? Was it pure chance, or was there something that drew you to it?
Yeah, I can't remember exactly when it was. It was published in 1996, and I would say it's a deeply 90s role-playing game.
Oh, yes.
In a lot of ways.
In fact, like, if you look on the Wikipedia article, part of the inspiration for it apparently came from, like, a specific illustration in one of the Vampire the Masquerade books.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah. Someone saw this picture and went, "Oh, I could do something with this." Like a whole idea just from this one picture.
Yeah, exactly. And I should say we'll be discussing Deadlands Classic. There is a new version, which I think they've changed quite a bit about different things. But obviously we were playing the original Deadlands back in the day.
I think there are a couple even, aren't there? Because there've been a couple of D20ify it at some point.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
And it was also put out using the Savage Worlds system.
Yes, and I'm not really familiar with the later version, so I can't speak to that. But yeah, back in that when I first came across it, I mean, I think I really sort of loved cowboys, Western stuff for reasons I don't recall, but they, everyone has their thing, and I liked a Western. The other thing is, like, back then, obviously, internet was pretty in its infancy, and so there wasn't the same extent to which you could just go out and find the stuff you'd like, and you were much more reliant on whatever the local game store happened to have on the shelf, and this happened to be on the shelf. And so I picked it up and I liked it, and that was the first game that I ever GM'd, so it kind of has a special place in my heart.
I mean, that's the reason that I ended up, I think I've given it away now, but for a long time owning a copy of the West End Games Star Wars system, which is odd and uses nothing but D6s, and to be honest, I still like a lot of the things that it does. It's just it requires you to roll handfuls of D6s and then add up the result rather than count the number of a particular number you get. Mm-hmm. So it's a real have your calculator handy kind of.
And that was just on the shelf?
Yeah. I went, I kind of like Star Wars' vibe. And it's cheaper than anything else in the shop.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was Deadlands for me, basically. It also had this vibrant, quite strange in retrospect, but that was the 90s for you, vibrant orange kind of cover, which was very eye-catching.
Yeah, I went and looked, and I don't have any of the original books, but I found a copy of Reloaded, which is the Savage Worlds version, and it still has a lot of that, some of it's fantastic, some of it's quite amateurish, but all of it's really pops that kind of 90s RPG art to the point of being garish sometimes.
Yes, yeah, lurid, maybe. Yeah. So the Deadlands was a lurid orange, and then they had this Hell on Earth spin-off, which I think was post-apocalyptic, same setting, and that was kind of a lurid, grotesque green. So yeah, it was deep in sort of 90s fluoro color schemes.
So the thing that struck me rereading, because Reloaded changes the system to Savage Worlds, but it keeps it keeps all of the kind of setting and lore stuff, and there is a lot there because they set out to create an alternate Wild West where you can have magic and zombies and steampunk gizmos and all kinds of stuff, but the way they get there is gosh, there's a lot of reading of background fiction to explain where you're at.
Yeah, and I feel that's also emblematic of it being such a 1990s game where, yeah, I mean, the lore, again, maybe this is because the internet wasn't such a thing back then, but you buy these books and you partly buy them just to read, and so you want hundreds of pages of lore. And Deadlands certainly provided that. And I think maybe with the later materials, again, another 1990s thing was this idea of the meta plot. So new books would come out and they would sort of advance the official lore or story of the setting, which is quite strange, I think, in retrospect. If I sit down to play a role-playing game, I don't want other people to tell me what events have happened. That's the whole point, is we tell our own story.
Yeah, I mean, it's you're right, it's odd. I feel that's another thing that we kind of have the World of Darkness to thank for. Yep. They seem to me like the people who really pioneered that as a thing. And in that case, with them, it always felt to me a bit cynical. It was a way of, the Magic the Gathering people would be you have to get the newest generation of cards in order to stay competitive, and I would quite feel superior because my $140 book was the same as the last time I looked at it. But this was a way of making that not the case, you had to keep up with the meta plot if you wanted to be current. And I did know people who took the World of Darkness one very seriously.
Yes, totally. Yeah, I think Deadlands was definitely singing from that same songbook, both in terms of, and I guess the whole splat book idea where they just keep coming out with books for particular niches, which it's questionable. Do you need a whole book about, Deadlands had one for New Orleans, one for Utah, one for California, one for the South as a whole, one for Canada, I think, one for Mexico. And it's you could probably extrapolate a lot of that stuff yourself, but they sort of had just book upon book, detailing every corner of the setting. And yeah, each book would sort of advance the meta plot as well, and you kind of felt like you had to keep up with it, which I never did.
No, I mean, like once you get into, so the way that the book's divided, I'm guessing that this is the same with the original, but the way it's divided in the Reloaded is there's like a first half of the book that you're allowed to let everybody see. And then there's a back half that explains what's really going on. And once I kind of flipped through to that bit in the PDF, it kind of became deeply disappointing in a number of ways. Because I guess, like, playing the game with you, one of the things that I appreciated about it was that there is a lot of kind of mystery to Deadlands from a player's point of view. There's all of this stuff that's going on, and it's, well, I suppose you don't have to do it this way, but you know, you come into a place and there's something awful under the surface that you end up investigating, and that was very compelling. And just kind of knowing that it's a big squabble between evil spirits, which are kind of horribly misappropriated, it kind of cheapens it a bit.
Yeah, I mean, so the for people who are not familiar, the game sort of follows real world history until 1863, and the divergence point is where I think there's a confederation of Native American shaman who perform some ritual to drive out European settlers and instead kind of unleash these spirits that are going to bring about the apocalypse. So you can see, like, right from the point of divergence, it's getting quite problematic, where it's like this sort of evil Native American magic is bringing about the end of the world.
When we're going to keep saying it's a really 90s thing over and over again. So if you would like to be very drunk as a listener, take a drink every time we say this is a really 90s thing. And stop if it feels like you're going to die. But it feels like a really 90s thing because it's that like 3 wolves in the moon and a Native American man on a t-shirt view of Native American culture, where like they did this awful thing that causes this horrible cataclysm that's going to end the world, but they did it because of how terrible the white people were. And so it's like this kind of gesture in the direction of trying to be progressive or sympathetic somehow.
Yeah, it's almost in a way worse because, it definitely has that flavor about it. It's not like 1930s cowboy films where the Native Americans are just there to be slaughtered and or slaughter the settlers. You know, it's trying to do something better, but it just ends up with kind of noble, savage, good indigenous people, and then the ones who unleash the demons as well.
And I mean, you could fall from one to the other by, you know, taking the wrong ancient lesson or something. Yeah, it's
yes, that's right. Yeah, but to go back to your point about the sort of like the secrets, you know, it did have this kind of GM, or I think it was called the Marshal in Deadlands, section of the rule book that only they could read. And I think you're right that like was probably much more satisfying as a player to not know that stuff, because you're only going to be disappointed by by the answers, because it wasn't, you know, as you say, that some of the answers were pretty hokey. And
I mean, a lot of the stuff that, so one of the things that you said when we were having sort of pre-discussions on Discord about how this conversation might go is that you were saying that an interesting point of comparison would be Dogs in the Vineyard, which I also managed to read. And I hadn't read before. It's cool. Although it's got a couple of problems of its own. It's also kind of its time. But
it's intentionally out of print, which I think says something about...
Yeah, it does. It does, rather. And the person responsible has gone on to be one of the people responsible for Apocalypse World, which is now the kind of indie darling engine for everything.
Yeah, one of the most influential games of the past, 15, 20 years.
Yeah. But one of the points of comparison is that I think one of the things that works best about Deadlands are the kind of slightly causeless, and if you think about it, kind of hokey, but like emergent things that they build in. So, which is like Dogs in the Vineyard is all about being emergent and giving people choices, letting them make the choice, and then dealing with whatever they do. I guess the specific thing I'm thinking about from Deadlands is there's a resource that your character has called Grit, which is it just generally makes you better at basically everything. If you do magic, it makes you better at magic. If you get into stressful situations, from memory, it makes you less likely to freak out, which we should talk about, because people freaking out, I remember, being a massive problem. But if you get enough grit, then you will be haunted by demonic cows. I
forgot about that.
Yeah,
how did I forget about that?
They will moo at you in the distance, and then you will be attacked by the ghostly cows from Ghost Riders in the Sky.
Exactly. It was just Ghost Riders in the Sky. They just listened to that song. I thought this should be in their game.
Yeah, and it's kind of goofy, but also like they're kind of terrifying. And
yes,
one of the things I do have a little bit of nostalgia for about 90s game design is that people really liked this kind of balancing act mechanic. Like Mage had it where you had to keep I can't remember what it was called, but your stat for how good you were at magic, you had to keep it kind of in the middle, because if you go too far into being good at magic, you'll disappear off into another dimension. Changeling did it as well, and you'd sort of get echoes of it with Werewolf. Like,
yeah, you're right. There was quite an in vogue sort of mechanic.
We're going to give you a resource that makes you better at being a werewolf, but if you have too much of it, you'll freak out all the time.
Yeah. That is, it's a lot of fun. You're not just trying not to fail; you're trying to not succeed too much. Have you looked at Apocalypse Keys at all? Recent Powered by the Apocalypse game?
No, I haven't. I haven't looked at much Powered by the Apocalypse anything, to be honest.
Just as this interesting innovation where in most Powered by the Apocalypse games, you either fail or partially succeed or fully succeed. But in Apocalypse Keys, the same range of results is, I think, fail, fully succeed, or succeed too much. So that's kind of the same idea, but coming back from a different angle. But you're right that a lot of those 90s games had that already baked in.
Yeah. I mean, this might be a good opportunity to talk about like mechanics in general, because that's the other thing I remember about Deadlands is that it was a 90s thing. Take a drink. But like everyone felt like they needed their own bespoke system for everything. There wasn't as much we'll just use Powered by the Apocalypse, or we'll just use Blades in the Dark, as it feels to me like there is now. And in Deadlands, that meant that the thing they came up with is kind of Baroque, it has all of these elements which I find aesthetically very compelling, because they use dice and cards and poker chips. So it's a real Wild West, gambling in a saloon vibe. But also, it was one of those games that genuinely expected you to track every single bullet. It had little tracks on the side of the character sheet that you could
with
put
a paperclip. You would track it up and down.
And the reason that grit as a resource is important for not freaking out is that it was entirely possible to build a character who would just spend rounds, which could be half an hour of real time, depending on how complicated what everybody in their turn was trying to do, completely unable to do anything because they just failed a courage check and ran away.
Yes, very much of its time where they're so sort of weighed down by the system that, at the table, as you say, people would fail some check and they'll not be able to do anything for a long time. And that's exacerbated because it's quite very mechanically hefty. So everyone's turn just takes ages. And so, 30 seconds sort of in-game time could take hours to play out at the table. And if you fail some check, you're just sitting there doing nothing. Made worse because I think at one point we had 7 players. So you're really waiting a long time. I recall some people getting quite fed up because they every turn they were like, have I stopped freaking out yet? No, I am still under a wagon. Okay, check in with you guys in about half an hour. Yeah, very of its time, quite punishing. I actually wrote down a quote here just to sort of show off or explain an example of how bad this was. So you have a quickness stat, right? That's basically initiative. To get that stat, you draw a card during character creation. That card tells you how many dice you get, which might be like 3d6 or 4d10. You roll those to generate a target number. That number determines how many cards you draw for initiative. So if I roll 3d10, get a 10, and then I roll again because 10s explode, I get a 13. That 13, I look it up on a table, lets me draw 5 cards, and that's my initiative. And that's just to, like, before you've even begun, combat or whatever. So just incredibly arcane procedures.
But I mean, at the same time, what they're trying to do with these incredibly arcane procedures is, when it's not being wildly problematic, some like really fascinating kind of off the wall ways of doing things. One of my favorite bits of like Deadlands lore memory is the way that magic works.
Yes, I was going to say that as well. Yes, that's a great innovation, both mechanically, and I love the lore. So, and there's like Hoyle in the real world who wrote a book of games and kind of laid down or gathered different kind of games people already play and kind of systematized the rules, like poker and things like this. So there's Hoyle's book of games. So in Deadlands, the idea is that he actually can't quite remember how they phrased it, but basically
I think he like roamed Europe gathering the occult secrets of dozens of traditions or something like that, much the way that he wandered around the world picking up people's card games and
exactly.
like systematizing the rules.
He encoded these occult rituals in the games. And so in Deadlands, if you want to be a wizard, basically, you do that through cards. So it's kind of a wizard crossed with Gambit from X-Men. Quite a cool visual.
Yeah, except like the specific thing that you're doing is that you can, I think you've got a certain amount of power that you can use to just do stuff, but you don't have very much, and it replenishes quite slowly. So a lot of the time what you're doing in order to do anything magical is that you are briefly stepping out of time and playing a game of chance with a demon. So that you can get it to do what you want, and then you pop back into consensus reality with everybody else, and the thing either happens or something goes horribly wrong for you.
And the fun thing about that was that you actually would play that game. You'd draw a poker hand, and the higher your result, the better the magic goes. Super great example of sort of asymmetric design, where you're playing a slightly different game to everyone else, but alongside them, and they kind of dovetail. Really fun.
And I mean, partly I think this is your skill as a GM and coming up with interesting stuff. So cheers for that. But we had an occasion where like we had a character who was a huckster, and they had a disastrous series of botches, at which point it stopped being generically a demon showed up and it started being a specific demon who was like offering them more and more stuff. And eventually they failed badly enough that the demon just took them over and they became a recurring antagonist for a while. But like it opens up the ability to do things like that.
Yeah, totally. In a way that like, magic points and spells per day would not.
Yeah. No, like the idea that in order to do, because I think they do similar things with, I don't know that we ever actually had a shaman in our party. Because
no, I don't think so.
Even in the 90s, it felt. I think, but we think we did have a couple of blessed, which is like their version of clerics, people who do like faith magic.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And there was also mad scientists who I think had their own subsystem for creating, Wild Wild West steampunk inventions.
And all of those are risky, is I guess where I was going. Like none of them have just a spells per day. It's always your, Wild Wild West spider tank might catch fire, or your god might get mad at you, or like there's always some kind of risk in what you're doing.
Yes, and there was always the classic. I think most of them had some mechanics around, like that huckster example. You could sort of attract unwanted attention or risk corruption, that kind of thing. So there was always that risk reward kind of thing, which could be quite fun for complicating everything.
So, I mean, we stuck with Deadlands for a fair while. Were you like messing around with other things that you might want to explore, or were you like thoroughly on the Deadlands train for a while?
I think I was just thoroughly on the train, to be honest, which is strange for me because these days I've always got like in my back pocket 10 different games I want to run at any time, and I find it very difficult to stick to one and not want to, move on to the new exciting thing. But yeah, I think I was just thoroughly captured, and maybe that was the strength of, the splat books and the meta plot. That stuff, it was designed to hook you in, and I guess it did the job. It kept me kind of interested. The lore would update, and I'd want to sort of bring that to the table. I mean, it never really happened because, again, mechanics are quite slow. Things are quite slow moving. You're really zoomed into a particular location and event, so you're not going to find out that, for example, Abraham Lincoln has returned from the dead and he's fighting the demons over on the West Coast. That's just not going to come up, which is probably for the best because that kind of stuff is quite goofy. But
the returning from the dead is an interesting thing because that was like another kind of double-edged sword mechanic that they put in there. The idea that if you died, there was a certain amount of chance that you could come back as something called a harrowed, which is basically you're a sentient zombie carrying a demon around inside you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, totally iconic of the game, really, and the sort of mascot, if you like, was a character called Stone who appeared on the cover, illustrated by great 1990s illustrator artist Brom. Yeah, totally iconic. And I think the Harrowed were like possessed by a demon. That's what brought them back or something. Maybe not possessed, but the demon was along for the ride, if you like, and they become more demonic as time goes on. But yeah, you're right. That was again, another sort of risk-reward mechanic where you get to come back from the dead, but you're going to slowly become more creepy and...
And because like they're leaning into a very specific Wild West thing, they had so I was just reading this literally half an hour ago. They had a thing where if you drink a certain amount of alcohol, it will prevent you from smelling like you're dead. But it will make you smell like you're drunk, even though the alcohol doesn't affect you because you're dead. So they were clearly angling to have, zombie gunslingers just constantly drinking whiskey.
Yeah, I don't remember that, but that's pretty good. There's also a fun, you could take like edges and hindrances during character creation, sort of a point creation, and one of the hindrances, I think, is basically you have a mysterious past, but you don't know what it is, and the GM would draw a card from a playing deck, and there would be some secret about yourself, and those were actually super fun, and something I think you could still have in a game today, like that's aged really well. I think like some of them were, there's another sort of version of you that looks just like you. So that just opens up super fun, like role-playing moments where you sort of meet another person who looks just like you, and what's that about? And it's not necessarily giving you all the answers, but just creating a fun sort of weird situation.
Yeah, like the edges and hindrances thing is another, like, I remember that was a big World of Darkness thing, and I think some of those other like Savage Worlds might have done it as well. Just the idea that, I guess it was to try and make characters a bit more kind of flavorful and give them a bit more personality, that you would have things like that. And it's interesting because I was last episode I was talking to Mike Sands about various different games, and one of the things that he mentioned is the Silver Road, which is what Mask Witches of Forgotten Doggerland also uses. And that is like, what if you got an entire role-playing system and it was just edges and hindrances and there was nothing else?
Well,
because it's just like, pick two things you're good at and two things you're bad at.
Yeah, that's fun. Yeah, because the trouble with that, the way it was implemented in these 90s games, was that you could still kind of optimize the system, and I think most people did, and so you'd pick up like all the edges that would make you like good at combat or whatever, and then you'll choose hindrances that you can either like safely ignore or that aren't going to impact your game. And you'd end up with quite strange results, like a character who I don't know, started and had one leg and all these other hindrances that the person has chosen not for roleplay reasons, but just because they want the points, and then put those into combat skills. And
that was iconic of that like super weird character outcomes from min-maxing was exactly. Really iconic of 90s games in general. I remember playing in a werewolf game where we had a character who we nicknamed, I think, Blunt Force Trauma. But he was a werewolf from, I can't remember which clan it was, which clan of werewolves it was. Well, they're called tribes in werewolf. Anyway, which pack of werewolves it was, but he was from the super fighty group of werewolves, and he was an Arun, which is the super fighty auspice. So you get different kinds of abilities based on which moon you turn into a werewolf under, basically. So he was the fightiest tribe, the fightiest kind of werewolf, and he was also a world-class surgeon because there's a werewolf power that you can get in the Arun collection of powers, which just makes people fall over. Like you can just knock an opponent prone, and that comes down to a medicine test. That's the skill that powers it. And so he had 5 dots, which means that in fiction, he is among the best in the world at medicine, despite being as dumb as a bag of rocks and just like this muscle Hulk, just because medicine makes people fall over if he touches them.
Yeah, that's exactly how it would go. And quite a few people would do that kind of thing, very common. But, it was also fun. I mean, I think that's something that has been lost a little bit. I've sort of been thinking about this lately, but people talk about like lonely fun as part of RPGs, where it's not just all the fun at the table, it's also the fun you can have, like for the person running the game, they get to do prep and read adventures and make maps and stuff. But for players, there's not as much of that. And these kind of character creation systems would give them, if you're into the game, you can go home and take the books and you can spend hours like making your perfect character. And, maybe that didn't lead to great outcomes, but I think it's valid for like people to want to have something fun to do at home with the game, even if they're not the person running the game.
Yeah. Well, so I think that opens up an avenue of conversation, which I think is quite interesting. But we're around about at the halfway point, so we're going to take a quick break for station messages, and we will be back right after this.
Support this show and others like it by giving a donation. For more information, go to www.mpr.nz/donate.
And we're back. You're listening to Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast about great trash and difficult art. And this is produced by Manawatu People's Radio Te Reo Irirangi o Ngā Tangata o Manawatu with the support of New Zealand On Air, so cheers for that, guys. I'm talking to Tim Denee of Old Dog Games, also my old Marshall is the game-specific term from when we used to play Deadlands in high school. I'm deeply disappointed that you've chosen to wear headphones that do not permit you a cowboy hat. I should have told you off for that at the start of the show. You were just talking about like the way that the edges and hindrances system. So this was like an attempt to make characters more flavorful and more kind of give them a bit more personality and more quirks by giving you things that you were good at that gave you a certain amount of, they cost a certain amount of points. Yes. And then you could offset those by taking things you were bad at. And we were talking about the way that people, me included, would kind of min-max those things. And so you would end up with like really weird bundle of advantages and disadvantages that didn't make a lot of sense, but made you very effective in a particular way. And that reminded me of the way that that Vincent Baker talks about traits in Dogs in the Vineyard, because he's trying to do the same thing about making characters that have some personality and some interest. But the way that he approaches that is by just having your traits, instead of having a skill which is like shoot gun, you have a trait which is like fell off a horse when I was 10. And that becomes relevant in different ways and can make you roll dice in different ways. But it's kind of that same impulse of trying to get extra personality into your characters and make them not just like blank slate murder and steal stuff machines.
Yeah, I mean, they're a great contrast actually, because as I was saying, those kind of 1990s games allowed players to go away and do this in their own time and to really like see it as a little mini game to create the perfect character. Whereas, 10, 15 years on, Dogs in the Vineyard, I think it's 2004 that game came out. Not actually that long in the big scheme of things, but a whole different world of game design. And in that game, you definitely do not go away and make your character. It's all done at the table and collaboratively. And it's been a while since I've read the rules, but I think there's sort of like essentially a prologue thing, and you do these little scenes that happen before the main adventure starts, if you like. And these scenes, like, like you're saying with Fell Off a Horse or what have you, you kind of play that stuff out. And so you're sort of discovering who these characters are and telling that story in a very compelling way. And they really do feel like real people. So yeah, you're kind of, it's a game that gets much more of that kind of narrative drive in it, at the expense, I suppose, of, you don't get that kind of min-max little mini game you get to play.
No, you don't. I mean, that's sort of obviated because the way in which Dogs in the Vineyard deals with like challenge and the fallout for things going wrong is so different as to kind of be on another planet
Yes.
compared to Deadlands is like, again, in my conversation with Mike Sands, I talked about this wave of games that felt like they wanted to do something different from Dungeons and Dragons, but there were all of these kind of core assumptions about, like, there are a certain number of things that it's important to know about, and you need to know how good absolutely everyone is at absolutely all of them. Also, like, we're going to be going on adventures where you will face challenges and get stuff as a reward, probably, and by facing those you will progress in a particular way and become more powerful.
Yeah, they were very stuck in that paradigm, and I think also very stuck on some obligation to emulate reality. Like, you had to have like encumbrance and track how much you're carrying, and you had to know, have little rules for every case, like what are your drowning rules, what are your swimming rules. You couldn't just kind of figure it out in the moment. Everything had to be... Yeah,
and the thing is, like, I can see where some of that stuff would be compelling in some situations, right? Like, if the idea is maybe the story is that we're out in the middle of the desert and we're being harried by some sort of monster that's out there in the dark, then at that point, like, knowing exactly how many torches and how many bullets you have, and like implementing the you have to sleep or you'll be ineffective the next day rules, so that you really have to think about who's on watch. Like, that could be quite tense and quite interesting, but also Deadlands just makes you do that the rest of the time.
Exactly.
As well.
Yes, exactly. It's not very selective at all. So everything just drags. Yeah, you're right. I mean, but both kinds of systems became a lot more elegant about that as time went on. So you get story games that are much more focused just on the narrative and dramatic potential. But obviously there's also been a lot of development of sort of OSR style games, like, and they are also a lot smarter about doing things like tracking resources and delivering that sort of tense system based stuff without necessarily having to have this big bloated 300-page rule book with individual rules for every scenario you could think of.
Another like aspect of Deadlands, which is really focused in on that kind of simulation aspect, is the way that it handles getting hurt. Because now this is my memory, and I didn't find the original book, so you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong here. But the way that it works is that each of your body parts has a certain like number of wounds, is what they call them, that it can sustain before it's destroyed. And if your head or your chest is destroyed, then you die, obviously. But otherwise, you can end up with like one-armed or one-legged characters, because every time someone like hits you with something, there is a roll, because of course there is a roll, to locate that somewhere on your body. At which point, again, because of course this is the Deadlands design philosophy, that they divide the damage by your size, I think. So the bigger you are, the less damage you take. But like the idea of well, I guess the idea of moving things around so that it's not just hit points and something more flavorful happens, I felt was like, at the time, I thought was really interesting.
Yes, yeah. It's doing interesting things, but maybe hasn't just quite sort of arrived at the end point. And I think you're right that this was still pretty early days in terms of moving away from D&D, so it's still really stuck in a lot of those conventions. And it's probably worth mentioning that like D&D, some people have argued it's kind of in a Western mold where it's not really doing like medieval feudal fantasy. It's often like, sure, it's got swords and armor and stuff, but really it's more of it was written by Americans, and it's kind of in a Western sort of story style where you're kind of on a frontier and you're in these isolated towns with no sort of overarching power. And there'll be some local lawman in a general store, in a saloon or a tavern. And you kind of roll through town, you deal with problems, you pick up some money and you move on. So, I mean, I think in a way, Deadlands wasn't such a big leap in terms of the kinds of stories it was telling. Like that was a pretty logical extension, I think.
Yeah. It was just thinking about the like localizing things to limbs reminded me of actually the West End games. Star Wars had a thing where they did that as well. What they were trying to do was, I think, so to come, just like 5 thoughts at once problem. There's a thing that Dogs in the Vineyard does that then goes forward into other, like powered by the Apocalypse games do this, where the fallout for stuff going wrong could be that your character dies, but you don't like track hit points, and then when you get to 0, you're dead. It's more kind of negotiated, and it's more about like whether things are dramatic than that. And the West End Star Wars had character points and force points as resources that you could collect, and you could use them to do cool stuff. And it also had an explicit system where if you were about to die, you could trade in a force point and like lose a hand or something instead, because they were going for the like, no, you're not my father, hand chopped off, fall out the spaceship, get rescued, get a robot hand vibe. And I like trying to, it's interesting because it feels like a step between where Deadlands is at about we can make this more messy and interesting, in the direction of we can make this more dramatic, which is where Dogs in the Vineyard ends up in like 2004, as you say.
Yeah, you're right. They clearly want that dramatic moment where the hero loses their hand, or you know, you don't always want the characters just to die all the time, because that's kind of the end of the story. So ideally, if someone loses a limb or something, that's like perfect, like great dramatic, memorable moment, but things can continue from there. So you almost have to build this whole system just to hopefully arrive at those kind of dramatic moments. But yeah, I mean, I guess the innovation later was to just have those moments happen without needing this whole convoluted emulation of reality to get to the point where the hero loses their hand. You can just have that happen.
Yeah, you could just say that that's what happens.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's trying to do two things at once, right? Like it's trying to be, because part of Dungeons and Dragons' DNA is the idea of like the murder dungeon, you know, like like you would bring your character with you to a Dungeons and Dragons tournament in the 1970s, and you would all try and go through this fiendish dungeon full of awful traps that would, and losing your character would be a bit like, but then again, like making a new one's reasonably quick. So you might
it's almost a sport, like competitive dungeoneering.
That's right. And so like you might get invested in a guy that you've had going for a long time, but also like making a character is quite quick. Whereas Deadlands, like it does lean into that. This is a mean, nasty, dangerous world, and death is like really likely. But building a character is going to take you a couple of hours.
Yes, I'm also reminded of when there's like a pest in the wilderness and they release another animal to kill the pest, and then you have to release a third thing to kill. It's kind of an arms race, and that sort of happens in games like Deadlands, where they, because character creation is so involved and they do want that story, they want the deadly system because that's part of the genre expectations, but they don't want your character to die. So you get like these different resources, like you would get fate chips in Deadlands, and you could use those to save your character at certain times. And you have grit, as you said, and then like this injury system, so you might lose a limb instead of dying. And And so you end up with all these like little gotchas and one-off resources you can use and points, because they want you to feel like you could die, but they don't actually want you to die that often.
Yeah, because it's a giant hassle,
Yes.
If nothing else. The fate chips reminds me of another thing which I think is quite actually genuinely innovative, which is the way that they handle sort of like karma. So the marshal has they say a hat, and so presumably they intended you to have a literal cowboy hat, that you fill with poker chips. And I think you get those at the end of a session for doing stuff, but you draw them blindly from the hat. And the colours of the chips mean things, and what the players do contributes chips of different colours to the hat. So if you do particular stuff, you can make it easy for the marshal to do awful things to you. And if you do other stuff, then you can end up with, like, you can kind of change the luck of the world in the way that you're behaving.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, because I think the marshal would draw from the same hat as the players. And yeah, different colors would do different things. I think black chips were like the most sort of impressive. So yeah, it was kind of an interesting system because it was, it affected both the marshal and the players. It was kind of an XP system. I think you would use these chips to like level up occasionally, as well as sort of saving your own life.
Yeah, I think they, again, like the West End Games Star Wars system, I think they were a bit like the way that they handled character points, which is that you could spend them like XPs to make yourself better at things. But you could also spend them in play as a resource to give yourself an extra dice on a roll or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. And they did have a sort of, I think, that moral component where different things would kind of lead to different colors of chips, depending on what you did. So it wasn't as simple as like you bet the monster, so you get 5 chips. It was kind of, depending on what you did, you might get a different kind of chip. It's quite interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I like that idea of like a shared resource and maybe in some way there's a bit of like a calculus about, well, I just drew 4 kings out of the deck, so I know there aren't any of those, so I can trust that this thing's like that's thinking in a kind of like meta-gamey, like games as competition-y game things way. That's quite an interesting way to approach it.
Yeah, that part was fun. And as you say, the physicality of those props, I think, was quite immersive to get you into the mood, like having all these cards in front of you and poker hands and poker chips and all the rest. I
mean, particularly cards, because they're like, they're omnipresent and everyone recognizes them, but they're also old enough and kind of divorced enough from anyone's knowledge, unless they're a really, really deep games nerd, that like the question of like why hearts and clubs and diamonds and spades is like there's something there, like they're kind of evocative and mysterious and you don't quite know where they come from, and they might do weird magic stuff because people use
totally.
them for
It's very
magic
believable,
tricks.
Right? Like,
yeah,
they always just feel like tarot adjacent.
No, exactly. And like, have you read any Tim Powers? To digress.
Yes.
Yeah, he has that whole thing about like playing poker with tarot cards to do awful magic.
Yes, yeah, I love that book. I think I actually tried to play a game of that game that he made up for that book. I forget what the game is called.
Yeah, I
think he invented a style of poker, right?
Yes, I think it's called Assumption, because the central ritual is about you can buy someone's hand off them in the course of the game, and that lets you control them or something. If people aren't familiar with Tim Powers, he's a guy whose whole shtick is that he looks up real world history and then fills in the gaps with occult weirdness, and that is his fiction. And he did normally his books are standalone, but he did a series around a real earthquake that happened that involved people doing magic by playing poker with tarot cards. And I think someone swallowed a ghost or something. It's a long time since I've read them, but they're very good.
Yeah, very fun. All his books very fun.
All right. Well, look, we are pretty close to the end of time here. Thank you very much for talking. This has been a lot of fun looking back at a game that, like, we didn't even begin to scratch the surface of how problematic it is in the way that it deals with Native American culture and Chinese culture because it wants to have kung fu, and so it brings in like chi mastery and as
again very 1990s.
Yeah,
I think we should also just drop in that like the Civil War doesn't end, and so the Confederacy is still around, and they decide to end slavery just because they want. There's some reason.
And so I don't know if this is directly lifted from the classic, but in Reloaded, it's literally in one of those like inserted into the text boxes where they basically just say racism is over.
Exactly,
now.
Racism is over, which obviously is quite very problematic, and the whole idea that like these African American slaves would just be happy Confederate.
And
people.
I mean, it's like extra double because what they're trying to do is say, don't build a racist character.
Exactly.
Don't be racist. Only bad people are racist. But they do that by saying racism is over. Even the bad guys have stopped doing slavery.
Yeah. And they essentially say, it's like having Nazi Germany around, but saying, they're fine.
Yeah. They stopped doing that whole Jews thing.
Exactly.
Only bad people don't do that. We just like the uniforms.
Exactly. And also worth mentioning, the two biggest like supernatural fighting factions are the Texas Rangers and the Pinkertons, one for the North and one for the South, which obviously are both deeply problematic institutions. I think Texas Rangers are responsible for all sorts of massacres in the real world, and Pinkertons obviously were union busters and league breakers and awful people, and funnily enough, recently involved in some Wizards of the Coast Magic the Gathering. Wizards of the Coast sent Pinkertons to someone's house to reclaim Magic the Gathering cards, which was a whole controversy.
Geez, right, yes. And actually a final warning, because this is a thing that I didn't really know very much about, and I still don't really know very much about it, but I am basically, my circle of people I follow has expanded enough on Twitter that sometimes I see American Indigenous people talking about this sort of thing in passing. For Indigenous people in particular, there was a period, particularly in the 90s, where certain like Indigenous entities, like the difficulty is that there are entities that you're not supposed to talk about because talking about them like attracts their attention and gives them power. I think I am a Palangi bloke. I don't know this stuff. I see people talking about it on Twitter while studiously not talking about it because that's the thing you're not supposed to do.
Interesting.
And these entities are straightforwardly used as antagonist monsters in Deadlands, and I believe are even a clan of werewolf in Werewolf the Apocalypse.
Wow.
Like, if this sort of thing is important to your psychic health, you need to watch out for it because people did not give a hoot, or like didn't understand enough to give a hoot.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, again, I haven't read the later stuff, but certainly Deadlands classics, I'm 90% sure there wasn't any sensitivity reading or anything like that.
I don't think it was an idea that people had at that point.
No.
Yeah, it's there's a recurring thing where they talk about like there's a family of inbred magicians called the Whateleys who get particular bonuses to doing magic if you choose to be descended from them, and if you're a man it makes you ugly, and if you're a woman it might make you ugly or it might make you hot.
That sounds about right.
There are a few different ones of those where they gender things in very strange ways as well.
Yes.
Like they just make a point to make mention that like if you're a woman this could be horny.
yeah, very much so. Yeah, and the hindrances obviously include some stuff that's pretty problematic by today's standards. Like I think just being fat is a hindrance, and it's like okay.
Oh yeah, and mental illness as well.
Yes, yep.
The great 90s mental illness roll on a table, get a mental illness wave, which was everywhere. Everything had it. It was in Rifts. It was in the World of Darkness. Deadlands definitely has it. If you're a mad scientist, you got to be mad. Yeah, it's anyway.
It's a minefield.
It has been a lot of fun talking about this strange, janky game that nonetheless does some very interesting things. if there are, like, if people are hankering for that Weird West vibe or anything like that, are there things that you would genuinely recommend that they check out?
I mean, not without reservation, perhaps, as with all things. But certainly, like, in terms of other media, I mean, I think surprisingly hasn't been that many weird Western media properties, but I think Bone Tomahawk, the movie, came out mid-2010s.
I think, like, probably the difficulty is that the Wild West as a thing is so fundamentally problematic that it's very difficult to do anything that's not, like, uncomfortable.
Very
in
difficult
some
to
ways.
tackle. On another Discord, Slack community I'm on, someone described the time period as sort of one of intersectional fuckery, which I think is pretty good.
Yeah, no, that's perfect, really. I'm sure you could do something, but it's just that all of the things that people think of as, like, Wild West tropes come from such a specific and problematic section of source media that you're then building on.
And so much of the ills of our current time sort of have their birthplace there. So it's really like, you know, the cradle of bad things.
Yeah,
in some ways.
I mean, like, I was listening to a thing where they were saying the first use of aeroplanes in warfare was busting workers' strikes and, like, busting miners' strikes in about, like, this period.
Sounds about right.
Yeah, it's tricky stuff. Yes.
I was going to say Bone Tomahawk. Bone Tomahawk is pretty fun if you want a Weird Western kind of thing. Ostensibly, it's basically about Morlocks, I think, but it's kind of a slow burn. It's not a explicitly supernatural setting, so you kind of get gradually exposed to that. The problematic part is that they do kind of have a sort of like, they're kind of portrayed as, like, quote unquote savages, essentially, you know, loincloths and whatnot, and they're very evil bad guys. I mean, they do also make a point of having like a normal Native American character to show that the Morlocks are not meant to be Native Americans, but it's still dicey. Yeah.
Would you recommend tracking down Dogs in the Vineyard, which you, as we say, is deliberately out of print? And
I would say yes, with the caveats that, I mean, Vincent Baker, the author of it, has, I think, at times said he was interested in reprinting it, but he wanted to revisit the setting because it has these. It's based on pre-statehood Utah, and you essentially play Mormon.
The thing it does, which I could see being a problem, is that it looks at pre-statehood Utah. So you're talking about essentially a Mormon theocracy or a scattered Mormon theocracy, and then it takes that religious worldview 100% at face value. To the point where, like, if people do sex stuff, which we would consider to be, like, perfectly normal and healthy between consenting adults, that could lead to the town being attacked by literal demons, depending on how you choose to tone the game.
Yes. I mean, there's layers of dramatic irony. Like, I think the game is interested in you playing characters who have a very different moral outlook than you do, and that's part of what makes it interesting. But obviously, that's quite a fraught way to approach something.
Yeah, and I feel like a genuinely modern game, like a game from the last 5 years or so, that was interested in doing something like that would be much more explicit about saying, like, there's a wall between you and the character. This is stuff that the character believes, and you might put a different gloss on the way that they behave. Or this is a world which operates by these rules. It's very clear that ours doesn't. And I'm interested in looking at what the mechanics of a world that was literally governed by this kind of god would be like.
Exactly.
But it's not really laid out in those terms in the text.
No, that's right. And it was written in 2004, so it doesn't talk about safety tools or anything, which you would also want to cover these days. But having said all that, super interesting game. Probably, I think, one of the most interesting games to sort of cover, like, the Old West, if you like. So definitely worth having a Google if you think that sounds interesting.
And in terms of mechanical stuff, the thing that it does, where it gets you to roll all of your dice and then treat them like a public hand of cards. And so you essentially, like, you roll all of the dice that you could roll for this conflict that you're in, and then you kind of trade them out one by one to try and overmatch the other person is very interesting.
Yes, kind of raises and calls. Yeah, super interesting. And that kind of moral ambiguity is really fun as well, where, potentially being problematic, if you put that aside, that subjectivity, I suppose you could say, where your characters are these watchdogs and you make a ruling in the community, that ruling then becomes like law. It becomes the religious proclamation. And the idea is when you move to the next town, these rulings you made kind of follow you around, and the ruling you make in one situation you might find problematic in the next ones. And so it kind of explores, how these belief systems can become quite contorted.
And specifically, like, the idea is that you're playing people in their early 20s who have been told that their job is to go in and be the moral arbiters of God. Like, you are the literal servants of God whose job is to bring justice to all of these remote settlements, and you are 21. Or possibly 18. Like that is a really interesting thing that he's trying to do there.
Yeah, fascinating game.
And finally, plug your things again. So obviously, Kiwi RPG Week is coming up. If people want to find out about that, kiwirpg.com is the place to go. But specifically, Old Dog Games things, where are those?
Well, they are at olddog.games, the website, and on Twitter, at olddoggames, one word. Those are the best places to find my stuff. I am actually working on a Forged in the Dark Western game, unsurprisingly, which I've kind of been noodling with for some years, but I do hope to get it out in the next year or two. And so if any of this sounds interesting to you, you might like to check that out. It's called Blood Red Clouds in the Western Sky.
Oh, that's an excellent title. It's a country song waiting to happen.
Exactly.
Thank you very much for talking, Tim.
Thank you, Hugh. It's been a blast.
You've been listening to Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast from Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. The show was produced and presented by me, Hugh Dingwall, and I also composed our theme music. It's called Sack Jazz, and you can find it at wolfboy.bandcamp.com. If you enjoyed this show, why not go ahead and share it with a friend? You can find the last 10 episodes at npr.nz/show/reserved, or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you want an episode older than that, try searching for Reserved Recommendations on YouTube. You can find me on Twitter at Objective Realty, or you can follow the show on Facebook. And finally, Manawatu People's Radio is a non-profit community access station. If you like this or any other piece of their fine audio programming, why not fling them $1 or $2? You can go to npr.nz/donate for more information on how to do that.